The Silverstone MS12 is a newer M.2 SSD enclosure that promises to not only protect your M.2 SSD but also keep it cool even under heavy loads. While the market is oversaturated with SSD enclosures, the Silverstone MS12 is no ordinary enclosure, as it uses the USB 3.2 Gen 2 x 2 interface, which offers speeds upwards of 20 GB per second. The Silverstone MS12 is an M.2 SSD enclosure made entirely out of metal, aluminum to be specific, with a surface that is designed to dissipate the heat of the SSD instead of looking good in your hands. Therefore, the panels of the enclosure have large fins going the entire length of the casing. It is a good design actually that looks good and will be functional. When we talk about pricing, this enclosure has a price of $69.99 US, which is not cheap for an enclosure. However, the Silverstone MS12 is not just an enclosure, as it will actively cool the installed M.2 SSD and offer a good protection against impacts. The top part of the enclosure has the Silverstone logo and a QR code painted next to the MS12 model name. What is interesting to see is that the MS12 has its top and bottom panels attached to the metal body by 4 hexagonal screws instead of clips. This basically guarantees that the enclosure will survive a medium impact and will last a long time, at least its metal-made casing will. The only port of the Silverstone MS12 is on one of the sides, and it's a simple USB Type-C port. Next to it we have a small blue activity LED, which you will barely see if it's not turned on. Before we talk about the internal construction of this enclosure and the performance, we need to see what's included with it. And we start with a 30 cm long USB Type-C cable, 2 thermal pads each with a different thickness, an extra 4 hex screws and a dedicated hex screwdriver. You will also get an extra standoff and SSD screw. Opening the Silverstone MS12 is easy, as you have to unscrew the 4 screws at the top using the included screwdriver. Afterwards, the top panel just lifts from the body of the enclosure and you are in. Inside we have a simple PCB that can be easily removed for a better look. A great thing to see is that the enclosure has thermal pads on both sides. Thus, the SSD and the PCB will be cooled. The controller used on this enclosure is the ASMedia ASM2364. This is a second generation PCIe Express to USB 3.2 device controller and has been used in many M.2 enclosures and adapters. The maximum transfer rate available with this controller is 20 GB per second. The installation of an SSD inside the Silverstone MS12 is easy, as it involves removing 4 screws and inserting the M.2 SSD into the M.2 socket, and then you just do the reverse. For testing, I am using the Silicon Power P34A80 1TB SSD, which, when heavily used, can get up to 70 degrees Celsius. In addition, this SSD has a maximum reading speed of 3400 MB per second with a maximum writing speed of 3000 MB per second. With the SSD installed into the enclosure, the maximum temperature reached was 55 degrees Celsius, with the ambient temperature held up at 26 degrees Celsius. This is a temperature drop of 17 degrees Celsius, thanks to the MS12 enclosure. Not bad at all, but it was to be expected, as this enclosure is one big heatsink making contact with the SSD and its M.2 socket on both sides. When we talk speeds, as I've said previously, if you have an M.2 SSD that is capable of speeds of over 2000 MB per second, then you will limit its speed to 2000 MB per second, thanks to the controller used, and this is the case with the Silicon Power 1TB used in this review. Even though it was capable of 3400 MB per second, its maximum speed was around 2000 MB per second. This is not a bad thing, it's just the limitation of the controller used, and it's the same for many other enclosures that use the same or similar controllers for the conversion from M.2 to USB Type-C. The Silverstone MS12 can be had for $70 US at the time of this review, and you do get a lot for your money. This is not an M.2 SSD enclosure, this is a heatsink with a space in the middle for an SSD. It will actively cool the installed SSD and do so with ease. The all-aluminum construction is great and the used screws are solid. In addition, you do get spare screws included, which is a nice touch, as the screws are small and can be easily lost. In terms of the performance, the limiting factor is the used controller. With this enclosure, you will get a maximum speed of 2000 MB per second regardless of what M.2 SSD you use. Thus, plan your purchase accordingly. The Silverstone MS12 is good, and what does better than most SSD enclosure is the cooling. This is the highlight of this enclosure and what makes it worth the higher than average price. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and if you want to support me in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the 2 Substar pages of this channel.